stick with our coverage of the 51 recommended changes to the Reserve Bank and specifically whether the Governor Philip Lowe, who acknowledges mistakes, can keep his job when his term expires in September this year. Today, Jim Chalmers gave no assurances but said his decision about the next governor will be made mid-year.
Well, Governor Lowe's appointment is up in September, and in the ordinary course of events, the government would turn its mind to that appointment closer to the middle of the year, and that's my intention. My focus has been working with the governor, with the opposition and others, and particularly with the review panel, to finalise and now release the recommendations of the RBA review. I have said for some time that the right sequence is to release this with the government's initial views and then to contemplate the governor's appointment somewhere closer to the middle of the year, and that's my intention.
But Lowe, who's been the subject of a barrage of criticism, especially that call that interest rates would not be higher until 2024, says he's prepared to stay in the job if asked.
It's entirely up to the government whether I continue to serve in this role after September. If I was asked to continue, I would. If I'm not asked to continue, I'll find another way to contribute to Australian society.
But the Reserve Bank review urges more diversity in the opinions that the central bank listens to and that it be open to criticism. Even the voting of the Monetary Policy Committee will in future be revealed when an interest rate decision is made. So Peter Tulip is the Chief Economist at the Centre for Independent Studies and a former economist at the Reserve Bank. He's been an open critic about the way the RBA deals with dissenting views and joins me now. Peter, many thanks for your time. Give me your overall sense of what this review of the RBA achieves.
I think it's great. I think it doesn't change policy. It doesn't really change the framework, but it does change the process in very important ways. It makes the bank more open to scrutiny, both internally and externally. And so we should have fewer mistakes and we should be more confident in the decisions that the Reserve Bank makes.
Why would opening up the Reserve Bank's processes, the voting, having, if you like, some knowledge of dissenting views in there, why would that make it less prone to mistakes in the future?
Because at the moment, those dissents and alternatives are being hidden. And so they're not being given a full consideration. A lot of the alternatives are hidden under this veneer of consensus. And so there's very little debate as to what else or otherwise the Reserve Bank should be doing.
So the Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe today said, you've got to remember that there are 9 people on the board. But then you go back to the review, and the review gives you a sense that there are occasions when that board was almost blindsided or did not have information when decisions were being made about interest rates.
Yeah, the report repeatedly says that the board didn't receive information and didn't even ask for information on alternatives to its decisions. So what kind of a decision is it when you're given one option and you end up saying, OK, it's not really a choice?
Now it says that the Monetary Policy Committee, that the members there would be expected to go out and make at least one speech a year. So in other words, we'd hear their views. Now, in Australia, I wonder whether we're mature enough to cope with that. You can hear from the head of the Federal Reserve in New York, and that might be a different view to what the head of the Federal Reserve is actually saying, Jerome Powell. I'm just wondering if we hear dissenting views here in Australia, whether we're just going to get confused or whether we're mature enough to understand that this is what makes up the monetary policy, the interest rate settings in Australia.
There's going to be a learning process. When it starts out, I think a lot of the public and the media will think that this is a cacophony. The Reserve Bank is speaking with multiple voices. They don't know what they're doing. But eventually people will learn that's the way you make good decisions. You air your alternative views, you argue them backwards and forwards, and the contest of ideas in both the public sphere and behind closed doors is how you get better decisions.
Tell me, who should be on that Monetary Policy Committee? We get a sense of that today with Ian Ross, the former Fair Work Commissioner, being appointed to the board of the Reserve Bank, and he presumably goes onto that Monetary Policy Committee. Who else is likely to be there?
Oh, I think a lot of contenders for that are friends of mine, so I'm not actually going to give any names.
But would they be academics? Would they be economists who are, in many cases, theoreticians rather than being practical people?
Well, you want a mix. So you want some people with a knowledge of theory, some people with a background in empirical work, some people that do, and there are wide varieties of within the economic sphere, within academics, and very strong differences of opinion. Those differences need to be aired in the Monetary Policy Committee.
OK, so Philip Lowe was asked this today. I thought it was a very good question. With all of these changes that might come, with a new separate Monetary Policy Committee, with more open access to information, with the board having more access to information, would ultimately the result be any different?
That's a very good question. I think the clearest difference would have occurred before the pandemic, where the bank was making decisions that really did not seem to be thought through. And a bit of internal scrutiny and external scrutiny would have resulted in better decisions, and in particular, a lower interest rate prior to the pandemic. And so we would have had lower unemployment and inflation closer to the target. So there would have been better outcomes.
Why is it that the Reserve Bank ended up becoming such a closed shop? What do you think is the history of that?
Well, it's always been that way, and it's just had a culture in which it doesn't recruit from outside, it hires internally. The top leadership of the Reserve Bank started there, fresh out of uni, often 40 years ago. They've had minor temporary stints elsewhere, but they've spent their whole life within the Reserve Bank. And so that means their whole value system is caught up with the reputation of the bank. And that means a resistance to criticism and a defensiveness and a hostility to alternative views.
Do you get a sense that this was about trying to protect the castle as distinct from necessarily doing the right thing? Or is that being a bit harsh on the Reserve Bank?
I think they would have equated the two, but outsiders would not. That the interests of the Reserve Bank are not necessarily the interests of Australia.
OK, so given the fact that this report talks about the culture of the organisation, about the lack of dissenting views, about the resistance to those views as well, where does that leave Philip Lowe as the Governor of the Reserve Bank? You heard there that he wants to stay on if asked after September. Where does that leave him?
So this report is not really a vote of confidence in him, is it? There's a lot of these changes have been suggested before the review. It didn't come out of nowhere. All the submissions they got, people were expressing views like this beforehand, and the leadership of the Reserve Bank was not acting on it. So it's now being pushed into acting on it, and Phil Lowe doesn't seem to be the right person to drive these changes, which he was effectively resisting for most of his tenure.